He wasn't the strongest, tallest, or first choice, but God saw what others could not. This is the story of the boy destined to become Israel's greatest king. What makes someone worthy of wearing a crown? Is it their strength, their appearance, or their royal bloodline? When God searched for Israel's next king, he looked past the tall, the handsome, and the powerful. Instead, his eyes fell upon a teenager in the fields, armed with nothing but a sling and an unshakable faith. This is the story of David, a boy anointed in secret who killed a giant everyone else feared, who became the most wanted fugitive in the kingdom, yet refused to take revenge when he had the chance. A warrior who danced with wild abandon before God. A poet who wrote songs in caves while running for his life. A flawed man who committed terrible sins but never stopped returning to God's heart. His friendship would inspire loyalty beyond death. His victories would become legendary. And his failures would teach generations about true repentance. From the moment sacred oil touched his head in his father's house to the establishment of Jerusalem as God's chosen city, David's journey reveals a powerful truth. God doesn't choose the qualified, he qualifies the chosen. This is the epic saga of the shepherd king whose legacy would echo into eternity. Samuel was deeply sad. He had anointed Saul as Israel's first king, but Saul had disobeyed God, and now God had rejected him. The old prophet spent his days mourning for Saul, unable to shake the weight of what had happened. But God had other plans, and he wasn't going to let Samuel stay stuck in grief forever. One day, the Lord spoke to Samuel with a clear command. As recorded in 1 Samuel 16:1, God said, "How long will you mourn for Saul since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." This wasn't a suggestion, it was a mission. God had already picked the next king and Samuel needed to go anoint him, but Samuel had a problem. Fear gripped his heart as he thought about what could happen. In verse 2, Samuel replied to the Lord, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." Saul was still the reigning king, paranoid and violent. If he discovered that Samuel was anointing someone else to replace him, the prophet's life would be in danger. It was a legitimate concern. Saul had already shown how unstable he could be. God understood Samuel's fear, but he also had a solution. The Lord told Samuel to take a here with him and say he had come to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. This would give Samuel a legitimate reason to be in Bethlehem, a cover for his true purpose. God instructed him in verse 3, "Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel obeyed. He did what the Lord commanded and traveled to Bethlehem carrying his horn of oil and leading a heifer for the sacrifice. When he arrived in the small town, the elders came out to meet him and they were trembling. In verse 4 they asked him, "Do you come in peace?" The arrival of a prophet was always significant and it could mean either blessing or judgment. Samuel reassured them, telling them he had come in peace to sacrifice to the Lord. He consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to join him at the sacrifice. Everything was in place. The cover story worked perfectly. Samuel was now in Bethlehem, standing before Jesse's family, ready to complete the mission God had given him. But he still didn't know which of Jesse's sons God had chosen. He would have to wait for God to reveal it. When Jesse and his sons arrived at the sacrifice, Samuel's eyes immediately fell on the eldest son. His name was Eliab, and he looked exactly like what you'd expect a king to look like. He was tall, strong, and handsome, everything that screamed royalty. Samuel looked at him and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." In his mind, this had to be the one. It made perfect sense, but God had different standards. Before Samuel could move forward, the Lord spoke to him. In 1 Samuel 16:7, God said, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. This was a lesson Samuel needed to learn right there and then. Physical appearance meant nothing to God. What mattered was what was inside, the condition of the heart. So Samuel moved on. Jesse called his second son, Abinadab, and made him walk in front of Samuel. The prophet looked at him carefully, waiting for God's confirmation. But the Lord said, "No." In verse 8, Samuel told Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse brought forward his third son, Shammah. Again, Samuel examined him, searching for any sign that this was the chosen one. But once more, God's answer was clear. This wasn't the one. Verse 9 records that the Lord had not chosen Shammah either. One by one, Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. Each time, the prophet waited for God's signal. Each time he heard the same response, not this one. By the time the 7th son had been presented and rejected, Samuel must have been confused. God had clearly said one of Jesse's sons was chosen to be king, but none of these 7 were the right one. Samuel turned to Jesse with a direct question. In verse 11, he asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" It was a simple question, but it carried weight. If God said one of Jesse's sons was the chosen king and 7 had already been rejected, then there had to be another son somewhere. Jesse paused. Then he answered, "There is still the youngest, but he is tending the sheep." His response revealed something important. This youngest son wasn't even considered important enough to be called to such a significant event. He was out in the fields doing the work nobody else wanted to do. He was the forgotten one, the one nobody thought about when important visitors came to town. But Samuel wasn't satisfied. The mission wasn't complete. He told Jesse in verse 11, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." The sacrifice couldn't begin. The meal couldn't be served. Everything had to wait until this youngest son came in from the fields. Jesse sent someone to bring the boy in, and everyone waited. While everyone gathered at Jesse's house for the sacrifice, David was far away in the fields, completely unaware of what was happening. He was doing what he always did, watching over his father's sheep. It was a job that required patience, alertness, and responsibility. Shepherding wasn't glamorous work. It meant long hours alone, constant vigilance against predators, and little recognition from anyone. David was the youngest of 8 brothers. In that culture, birth order mattered a lot. The oldest son received the inheritance and the honor. The younger sons had to find their own way. Being the youngest meant David was at the bottom of the family hierarchy. When important guests came to the house, he wasn't the one invited to sit at the table. When decisions were made, his opinion wasn't asked for. He was just the kid brother, the one who took care of the sheep, while the older brothers did more important things. Nobody thought to call David when Samuel arrived. It didn't even cross Jesse's mind to bring him in. After all, what would be the point? Samuel was a great prophet, a man of God who had anointed King Saul himself. Surely he was there to meet with the important sons, the ones who were old enough, strong enough, and ready for whatever God had planned. David was just a boy with a staff and a sling, smelling like sheep and dirt. He didn't belong in that gathering, but God had a different perspective. While people looked at age, status, and appearance, God looked at the heart. And David's heart was something special. Out there in those fields, away from everyone's attention, David had developed a relationship with God that was deep and real. He didn't have an audience. He didn't have anyone watching or applauding. It was just him, the sheep, and God. Those quiet hours alone had shaped David in ways no one could see. He had learned to depend on God for protection, for strength, for companionship. He composed songs and sang them to the Lord. He prayed under the open sky. He learned what it meant to be faithful in the small things, even when nobody was watching. This time in the wilderness wasn't wasted. It was preparation. When the messenger arrived in the field with instructions to come to the house immediately, David must have been surprised. What could possibly be so urgent? He left the sheep in the care of someone else and made his way back home, probably wondering what he had done wrong or what emergency had happened. He had no idea that his entire life was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. As David walked toward the house, he was still just a shepherd boy with dirt on his feet and the smell of sheep on his clothes. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't dressed for a special occasion. He was just himself, simple, honest, and completely unaware that he was walking into his destiny. David arrived at the house and stepped inside. 1 Samuel 16:12 describes what Samuel saw when the boy entered. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. There was something striking about David, not just in how he looked, but in the life that radiated from him. He had been out in the sun working hard, living simply, and it showed in his healthy, ruddy complexion and bright eyes. The moment David walked in, God spoke to Samuel. The Lord's voice was clear and unmistakable. In verse 12, God said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." After 7 sons had been rejected, after all the waiting and wondering, here was the answer. This youngest son, the one nobody thought to invite, was God's chosen king. Samuel must have felt a rush of understanding. Of course, it was this one. God always chooses differently than people do. Samuel didn't hesitate. He took the horn of oil he had brought with him, the same oil that symbolized God's spirit and blessing, and he poured it over David's head right there in front of his father and brothers. This wasn't done in secret or in private. Everyone in that room saw it happen. Jesse watched his youngest son being anointed. The 7 brothers who had just been passed over stood there witnessing their little brother receive something they didn't get. Verse 13 records what happened next. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. The anointing wasn't just a symbolic gesture or an empty ritual. Something real happened in that moment. God's Spirit came upon David with power, equipping him for everything that lay ahead. He would need courage, wisdom, strength, and faith for the journey before him. And God was already preparing him for it. But here's what's remarkable. After this incredible moment, after being anointed as the future king of Israel, David didn't immediately move into a palace. He didn't start acting like royalty or demanding respect. He went right back to the fields to take care of his father's sheep. The anointing was real, but the timing was God's. David had been chosen, marked, and filled with God's Spirit, but he still had to wait for God's perfect timing to unfold. This teaches us something important about how God works. He often chooses people long before he positions them. He calls them and anoints them, then sends them back to their regular responsibilities to continue being faithful in the small things. The anointing wasn't permission to abandon his duties or get ahead of God's plan. It was a promise of what was coming, a guarantee that God had a future prepared for him. David kept that secret. He didn't go around telling everyone he was going to be king. He didn't challenge Saul or try to speed up the process. He simply went back to shepherding, trusting that the same God who had anointed him would also bring the fulfillment of that anointing in the right time. The oil had been poured, the Spirit had come, and now David waited with faith and patience. While David returned to his quiet life with the sheep, something terrible was happening to King Saul. 1 Samuel 16:14 tells us, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him." This was the consequence of Saul's disobedience. God's Spirit, which had been with him when he was first anointed king, had left him. In its place came an evil spirit that tormented him, bringing fear, paranoia, and darkness to his mind. Saul's servants noticed the change in their king. They could see he was suffering, troubled by something they couldn't fully understand. They wanted to help him, so they came to him with a suggestion. In verse 15 they said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you and you will feel better." It was a practical solution. Music has always had the power to soothe troubled souls, to calm anxious minds, to bring peace where there is turmoil. Saul agreed to their suggestion. In verse 17, he told his servants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." So the search began for a skilled musician who could bring relief to the tormented king. One of the servants spoke up. He had heard of someone who fit exactly what they were looking for. In verse 18, this servant said, "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." This description is fascinating because it reveals that David was already known for more than just his musical ability. People recognized that he was brave, that he had wisdom beyond his years, and most importantly, that the Lord was with him. The servant didn't know it, but he was describing the future king of Israel. He saw David as a talented musician, not realizing that this young man carried an anointing that would one day lead the entire nation. But even at this point in his life, before any great public victories, David's character and God's presence on his life were already evident to those who paid attention. Saul wasted no time. He wanted relief from his torment, and if Jesse's son could provide it, he needed to come immediately. First, Samuel 16:19 records what happened. Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David who is with the sheep." It was a command from the king, not a request. Jesse had no choice but to comply. Jesse prepared gifts to send with his son. In verse 20, we read, "So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul." These were appropriate gifts to present to a king, tokens of respect and honor. Jesse was making sure his son arrived at the palace properly with offerings that showed their family's humility and gratitude for this opportunity. When David arrived at the palace and came before King Saul, something clicked immediately. Verse 21 tells us, David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor-bearers. This was a significant position. An armor-bearer was someone who stayed close to the king, carried his weapons, and stood ready to assist him in battle. It required trust, skill, and loyalty. Saul didn't just tolerate David. He actually liked him very much. But more importantly, David's music did exactly what everyone hoped it would do. Verse 23 describes the effect. Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better and the evil spirit would leave him. David's playing had power. It wasn't just entertainment or background noise. Something about his music brought genuine relief to the troubled king. Why did David's music have this effect? Wasn't just technical skill or talent. David played his harp as an act of worship to God. His songs came from a heart that knew the Lord intimately. When he played, he was bringing God's presence into the room, and darkness couldn't stand in that presence. The evil spirit tormenting Saul would flee when David's worship filled the space. Saul sent word back to Jesse. In verse 22, the king said, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." This was high praise from a king. David had found favor in Saul's sight, and now he had a regular position in the royal court. The shepherd boy from Bethlehem was now serving in the palace of the king. But here's what makes this whole situation so remarkable. Saul had no idea who David really was. He didn't know that this young musician standing before him had been anointed as the next king of Israel. He didn't know that God's Spirit, which had left him, was now powerfully upon this teenager playing the harp. Saul looked at David and saw a helpful servant, a talented musician, someone who brought him comfort. He didn't see his replacement standing right in front of him. David's life now existed in two completely different worlds. Sometimes he was in the palace serving King Saul as an armor-bearer and musician. Other times he was back in Bethlehem tending his father's sheep in the quiet fields. 1 Samuel 17:15 captures this reality. But David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. His life became a rhythm of transitions from the royal court to the pasture, from music in the palace to solitude with the flock. This back-and-forth existence was important for David's development. In the palace, he learned about leadership, politics, warfare, and the responsibilities of royalty. He watched how Saul ruled, how decisions were made, how the nation operated. He saw both the glory and the pressure of kingship. He learned what it meant to serve under authority, to be faithful in his duties, to bring peace through his music, even when the atmosphere was dark and heavy with spiritual oppression. But in the fields with the sheep, David maintained his connection to simplicity and to God. The palace could have easily gone to his head. He could have started thinking he was important, that he deserved special treatment, that he was above the humble work of shepherding. But instead, David faithfully returned to care for his father's flock. He didn't despise the small beginnings or reject the simple work that had shaped him. In those fields, David did more than just watch sheep. His heart overflowed with worship. He composed songs to God, pouring out his thoughts, his praise, his questions, his trust. Many of the psalms David would later write had their roots in these moments alone with God in the wilderness. He had time to think, to pray, to develop his relationship with the Lord without the distractions and demands of palace life. The fields also tested David's courage in practical ways. Shepherding wasn't a safe job. Wild animals constantly threatened the flock. Lions prowled the hills looking for easy prey. Bears came down from the mountains, hungry and dangerous. As a shepherd, David's responsibility was to protect the sheep at all costs, even if it meant putting his own life at risk. This wasn't theoretical bravery. It was real-life danger that required real-life courage. David learned to fight during these years in the wilderness, not in a military training camp or under the instruction of experienced soldiers, but in life-or-death encounters with predators. He developed skills with his sling, practicing until his aim was deadly accurate. He built physical strength through the hard work of outdoor life. He learned to move quickly, to think strategically, to face fear and push through it. But most importantly, David learned to depend on God. Every time a lion or bear threatened his sheep, David didn't just rely on his own strength. He knew that God was with him, protecting him, giving him supernatural courage and ability. This faith wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was proven in battle, tested in real danger, and strengthened through actual victories. David was building a history with God, a track record of seeing God's faithfulness in impossible situations. Nobody in Israel knew what was happening in those fields, while David served in Saul's palace and tended his father's sheep. Something powerful was being formed in secret. His courage wasn't theoretical. It was tested and proven in real battles that no one witnessed except God. Later, when David would stand before Saul asking for permission to fight Goliath, he would tell the king about these experiences. In 1 Samuel 17:34-36, David would describe what happened. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear." Think about what those words reveal. When a lion came to steal a lamb, David didn't run away or watch helplessly from a safe distance. He went after it. He chased down one of the most dangerous predators in the region and struck it with enough force to make it release the sheep. And when the lion turned on him, because that's what cornered predators do, David didn't back down. He grabbed it by its mane, fought it with his bare hands, and killed it. The same thing happened with bears. These weren't small black bears. These were likely Syrian brown bears, massive and deadly. Yet David faced them the same way he faced the lions. He pursued them, rescued the sheep from their mouths, and killed them when they attacked him. This wasn't luck or chance. This was a consistent, repeated victory over deadly enemies. How did a young shepherd boy defeat lions and bears? The answer is found in what David would later say in verse 37. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." David's victories weren't about his own strength or skill, though he certainly had both. They were about God's presence and power working through him. Every time David faced a predator, he trusted that the same God who had anointed him as king would protect him and give him victory. These battles in the wilderness were preparing David for something much bigger. He was learning lessons that would serve him for the rest of his life. He learned that the size of the enemy doesn't matter when God is with you. He learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. He learned that faithfulness in small, unseen tasks prepares you for great public responsibilities. David also learned that God honors those who protect the vulnerable. Every time David risked his life to save a sheep, he was demonstrating the heart of a true shepherd, one who values each life in his care, who doesn't abandon them when danger comes, who fights for them even when it costs him something. This was the kind of heart God wanted in a king. Someone who would protect his people the same way David protected those sheep. The wilderness was David's training ground. While Saul's soldiers trained with swords and spears in military camps, David was receiving a different kind of education. He was learning to hear God's voice in solitude, to worship in simplicity, to trust in impossible situations, and to fight battles that no one else would ever hear about. He was being shaped into a warrior whose greatest weapon wasn't his sling or his sword, but his faith in the living God. The Philistines were Israel's constant enemy, always looking for opportunities to attack and dominate God's people. This time, they gathered their forces for war in a way that signaled something serious was about to happen. 1 Samuel 17:1 tells us, "Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Su in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephesim between Su and Azekah. King Saul received reports about the Philistine movements and immediately mobilized Israel's army." Verse 2 describes the response. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of A and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The valley of Ar was a strategic location, a place where armies could face each other across the terrain. It was narrow enough that large-scale battle formations would be limited, making it an interesting choice for confrontation. The two armies positioned themselves on opposite sides of the valley. Verse 3 paints the picture clearly. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another with the valley between them. This wasn't unusual for ancient warfare. Armies would take defensive positions on high ground, each waiting for the other to make a move. Attacking uphill gave a significant disadvantage, so both sides held their positions, creating a standoff. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of a traditional battle with both armies clashing in the valley, the Philistines had a different strategy in mind. They had a weapon that Israel didn't have. A fighter so intimidating that they believed he alone could decide the outcome of the entire war. This wasn't going to be an ordinary battle. The Philistines were about to change the rules of engagement in a way that would expose the deepest fears of every man in Israel's army. A man stepped out from the Philistine camp, and the moment the Israelite soldiers saw him, fear gripped their hearts. 1 Samuel 17:4 introduces this warrior, a champion named Goliath who was from Gath, who came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. That measurement translated to over 9 ft tall. This wasn't just a big man. This was a giant towering over everyone else on the battlefield. Verse 5 describes his armor. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. 5,000 shekels of bronze was about 125 lb of armor alone. Most men couldn't even walk wearing that much weight, let alone fight in it. But Goliath moved with ease, his massive frame carrying the burden that would crush an ordinary soldier. The description continues in verse 6. On his legs he wore bronze greaves and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. Every part of Goliath's body was protected by bronze. His head, his torso, his legs. He was a walking fortress, virtually impenetrable to normal weapons. The javelin on his back was just one of his weapons, ready to be thrown with deadly force. But his primary weapon was even more intimidating. Verse 7 tells us his spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. 600 shekels was about 15 lb just for the spearhead. The shaft was as thick as the beam used in weaving cloth, massive and heavy. This wasn't a weapon designed for quick strikes. It was designed to pierce through armor, shields, and bodies with overwhelming force. Goliath even had support. The verse continues, his shield-bearer went ahead of him. This man carried Goliath's shield, which was likely as large as a door, providing additional protection as the giant advanced. Everything about Goliath was designed to inspire terror, and it worked. Then Goliath spoke. Verse 8 records his words. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me." He was proposing single combat, a one-on-one fight that would determine the outcome of the entire war. His challenge continued in verses 9 and 10. "If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." This was the ultimate taunt. Goliath wasn't just challenging Israel's military strength. He was mocking their courage, their honor, and ultimately their God. For 40 days, this scene repeated itself. Verse 16 tells us, for 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Twice a day Goliath would step out, shout his challenge, mock Israel, and wait. And twice a day, not a single Israelite soldier stepped forward to face him. The fear was total and complete. Saul's army was paralyzed. These were trained soldiers, men who had fought in battles before, warriors who should have been brave and confident. But none of them were willing to face Goliath. They stood in their positions day after day, listening to the giants' insults, feeling the weight of shame, but too terrified to do anything about it. While the armies faced off in the valley of David was back in Bethlehem doing his regular work. 1 Samuel 17:15 reminds us of his routine. David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. He wasn't with the army. His three oldest brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, were there with Saul's forces, but David was too young to be enlisted as a soldier. Jesse was worried about his sons. He hadn't heard from them in a while, and with a military standoff happening, he wanted to know they were safe and had enough supplies. So he called David and gave him a mission. Verse 17 records Jesse's instructions. Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. But Jesse had more for David to carry. Verse 18 continues, take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. This wasn't just about delivering food. Jesse wanted proof that his sons were alive and well. He wanted David to check on them and return with news. Jesse added one more piece of information in verse 19. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Ar fighting against the Philistines. So David knew exactly where he needed to go. His father was sending him straight to the battlefield. Early the next morning, David did exactly what his father asked. Verse 20 tells us, early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. He was responsible and obedient, making sure the sheep were cared for before he left. He packed the grain, bread, and cheese and headed toward the valley of Ah. David's timing was perfect, though he didn't know it yet. Verse 20 continues. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. He arrived right as the soldiers were taking their positions for the day, the energy and tension high as they prepared for whatever might happen. David quickly found the supply keeper and left the provisions he had brought, then ran to the battle lines to find his brothers. Verse 22 says, he greeted them. It was a simple family reunion in the middle of a war zone. David was just checking in, making sure they were okay, planning to get the assurance his father wanted and then head back home. He had no idea this routine errand was about to turn into the most important moment of his young life. Then it happened. Verse 23 describes the scene. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. For 40 days, Goliath had been making this challenge, but this was the first time David heard it. This was the first time someone who actually believed in God's power was standing there listening to the giant's mockery. The moment Goliath appeared and started shouting, the Israelite soldiers reacted exactly as they had every other day. 1 Samuel 17:4 tells us, whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. This was the routine. The giant showed up, the soldiers ran, and nothing changed. Fear controlled everything. But David didn't run. He stood there watching and listening. He turned to the men standing near him and asked a question. Verse 26 records what he said. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? It was a practical question, but it revealed something important. David was already thinking about fighting Goliath, already considering what it would take to remove this shame from God's people. The soldiers answered his question. They told him what Saul had promised. Verse 25 gives us the details. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. These were significant rewards. Saul was desperate enough to offer his own daughter and massive financial benefits to anyone brave enough to face the giant. But David asked another question, and this one revealed what was really on his heart. The end of verse 26 records his words, Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? This question was completely different from what everyone else was thinking. The soldiers saw an unbeatable giant. David saw an enemy of God who had no right to mock the people of the covenant. The difference was crucial. Every other Israelite was measuring Goliath by human standards. His size, his strength, his armor, his weapons. By those standards, he was terrifying and unbeatable. But David measured Goliath by a different standard, his relationship with God. Goliath was uncircumcised, meaning he had no covenant with the Lord. He was defying the armies of the living God, which meant he was picking a fight with the creator of the universe. From that perspective, Goliath's size meant nothing. The soldiers repeated to David what they had already told him about the king's reward. Verse 27 says, "They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, 'This is what will be done for the man who kills him.'" They thought David was interested in wealth and honor. They didn't understand that his real motivation was defending God's reputation and removing the disgrace of Israel, allowing this pagan warrior to mock them day after day. David's questions and his different perspective were about to create waves that would reach all the way to King Saul's tent. David's oldest brother, Eliab, was standing nearby and heard everything David was saying to the soldiers. He wasn't impressed. In fact, he was angry. 1 Samuel 17:28 records his reaction. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." This was harsh. Eliab accused David of abandoning his responsibilities, of pride, of evil motives, and of just wanting to see the excitement of war. But there was probably more going on under the surface. Eliab was the one Samuel had looked at first when choosing a king, the one who seemed perfect but was rejected by God. Now here was his youngest brother, the one nobody thought was important, asking questions about fighting the giant that Eliab himself was too afraid to face. The accusation revealed Eliab's own insecurity and jealousy more than any real problem with David. David's response was simple and direct. Verse 29 tells us, "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can I even speak?" He didn't get defensive or argue. He just pointed out that he had simply asked a question. There was nothing wrong with that. Then verse 30 says, "He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before." David wasn't going to let his brother's anger stop him from finding out what he needed to know. Word about David's question spread through the camp. Someone told King Saul that there was a young man asking about fighting Goliath, and Saul sent for him. When David came before the king, he didn't waste time. Verse 32 records his declaration. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul looked at David and saw exactly what everyone else saw. A young man, inexperienced, not trained as a warrior. His response in verse 33 was immediate. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." In Saul's mind, this was ridiculous. David was just a kid. Goliath was a professional soldier who had been fighting since he was young. The mismatch was too great. But David had an answer ready, and it wasn't based on military training or combat experience. Verses 34 and 35 record what he told Saul. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it." David was telling the king about the battles nobody had witnessed, the victories nobody knew about except God. He continued in verse 36, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God." In David's mind, Goliath was just another predator threatening what God cared about. And just like the lion and the bear, he would fall. Then David said something that revealed the source of his confidence. Verse 37 records his words, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." David wasn't trusting in his own strength. He was trusting in the same God who had protected him in the wilderness. He had a history with God, a track record of seeing God's faithfulness in impossible situations. Saul looked at David and finally gave his permission. The end of verse 37 says, Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." It wasn't exactly a vote of confidence, but it was permission. Saul had no other options. No one else was willing to fight, so he might as well let this shepherd boy try, even if it seemed hopeless. Saul wanted to give David every advantage possible. If this young man was going to face Goliath, he should at least have proper protection. But Samuel 17:38 tells us what happened next. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. This was the king's personal armor, the best equipment available in all of Israel. Saul was significantly taller than most men. The Bible had earlier described him as head and shoulders above everyone else, so his armor was made for a large man. He placed it on David, probably hoping that royal armor would somehow give this shepherd boy a fighting chance against the giant. David tried to walk in the armor. Verse 39 describes what happened. David fastened his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. The armor was heavy, restrictive, and completely unfamiliar. David had never trained in armor. He had never fought wearing layers of bronze and leather. His victories over the lion and bear had come through speed, skill, and trust in God, not through heavy equipment. David realized this wasn't going to work. He needed to be himself, to fight in the way God had trained him, not to pretend to be a soldier he wasn't. The end of verse 39 records his decision. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. This was a crucial moment. David could have felt pressured to wear the armor because the king gave it to him. He could have worried about what people would think if he faced Goliath without proper protection. But David knew his own strengths and limitations. He knew how God had equipped him. And it wasn't with heavy armor and a soldier's sword. It was with the simple tools of a shepherd and complete dependence on God. Verse 40 tells us what David chose instead. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. This was the equipment of a shepherd boy, nothing more. A wooden staff, 5 stones from the creek, and a leather sling. To everyone watching, it must have looked like suicide, but David knew what he was doing. He had spent countless hours with that sling, practicing until his aim was perfect. He knew how to choose the right stones, smooth ones that would fly straight and true. He knew how to generate the speed and force needed to make a sling a deadly weapon. This was the tool God had placed in his hands, and he trusted it completely. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Goliath would come with bronze armor, iron weapons, and a shield bearer. David would come with stones and a sling. One trusted in military might, the other trusted in the living God. Goliath saw David approaching and couldn't believe what he was seeing. 1 Samuel 17:41 tells us, "Meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield-bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. The giant moved forward expecting to meet a warrior. Instead, he saw a teenager with a stick." Verse 42 describes Goliath's reaction. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. The giant was insulted. This was beneath him. Israel had sent a child to fight their greatest warrior, and Goliath took it as a personal insult and a sign of disrespect. Goliath's anger came out in his words. Verse 43 records what he said. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" He was mocking David, mocking Israel, treating the whole situation as a joke. Then he added, "And the Philistine cursed David by his gods." Goliath called on his pagan deities to witness his anger and presumably to help him destroy this boy. The giant's threats became more specific and graphic. Verse 44 tells us what he said. "Come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." This was psychological warfare meant to terrify David and make him turn back. Goliath wanted David to understand exactly what was about to happen. Total destruction. His body left unburied as food for scavengers, but David didn't flinch. Instead, he responded with words that would echo through history. Verses 45-47 record his answer. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." These words were a declaration of faith. David acknowledged what everyone could see. Goliath had superior weapons, but David had something better. He had the name of the Lord Almighty, the God who commanded the armies of heaven and earth. Goliath had defied that God, and now he would face the consequences. David's prophecy was specific. He would strike Goliath down and cut off his head. The Philistine army would be defeated, their bodies left for the birds and animals, just as Goliath had threatened to do to David. But the purpose went beyond military victory. The whole world would know there is a God in Israel. Everyone watching would learn that the Lord doesn't need swords or spears to save his people. The battle belonged to God, and he would give the victory. Goliath started moving toward David, ready to end this quickly. 1 Samuel 17:48 tells us, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. David didn't stand still or back away. He ran toward the giant while everyone else had been running away from Goliath for 40 days. David ran straight at him with confidence and speed. Verse 49 describes what happened next. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. One stone, one throw. The stone hit exactly where David aimed it, the one spot on Goliath's body that wasn't protected by armor. It struck with such force that it sank into his skull. And the giant who had terrorized Israel for 40 days fell forward, crashing to the ground. The narrator emphasizes an important point at the end of verse 49. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David had no traditional weapons. He didn't need them. God gave him victory with the simple tools of a shepherd. But David wasn't finished. Verse 50 tells us, David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. David used Goliath's own weapon to complete what he had prophesied. The giant's sword, which had been meant to destroy Israel's champion, instead became the instrument of Goliath's final defeat. The impact on the battlefield was immediate and total. Verse 51 describes what happened. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Their entire strategy had been built on Goliath's invincibility. With him dead, their confidence shattered instantly. The army that had been so bold for 40 days now fled in panic and terror. The men of Israel and Judah finally had their moment. Verse 52 tells us, "Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead was strewn along the Shahim road to Gath and Ekron. The chase was long and devastating. The Israelite army, which had been paralyzed by fear for weeks, now pursued their enemies with fierce determination, and the Philistines paid a terrible price for their arrogance. After the pursuit, the Israelites returned to plunder the Philistine camp. Verse 53 says, "When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp." Everything the Philistines had brought, weapons, supplies, treasure, now belonged to Israel. It was total victory. David took Goliath's weapons as his own. Verse 54 records, "David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put the Philistine's weapons in his own tent." The head was proof of victory, a trophy that demonstrated what God had done through a shepherd boy who trusted him. The weapons would become David's, a reminder of the day God gave him victory over impossible odds. After David's victory over Goliath, the army returned home in triumph. The battle had been won, the Philistines defeated, and Israel was celebrating. But something happened on the way back that would change everything for David. 1 Samuel 18:6 tells us, when the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. This was normal for ancient Israel. When the army won a great victory, women would come out to celebrate, making music and dancing in the streets. It was a spontaneous expression of joy and relief. But the content of their song created a problem. Verse 7 records what they sang. Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. It was a simple comparison, the kind of poetic exaggeration common in celebration songs. But the implications were devastating for Saul. The women were crediting David with greater victories than the king himself. In their joy, they had created a song that elevated David above Saul, making the young hero sound more impressive than the reigning monarch. Saul heard the song and it cut him deeply. Verse 8 describes his reaction. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought. But me with only thousands, what more can he get but the kingdom? Saul immediately saw this as a threat to his throne. If the people loved David this much, if they thought he was greater than their king, how long would it be before they wanted David to replace him? From that moment, everything changed. Verse 9 tells us, and from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The king's perspective shifted completely. David was no longer the helpful musician who brought him peace, or the brave young man who had saved Israel. Now David was a threat, a rival, someone who might take what Saul considered his own. Jealousy had taken root, and it would only grow stronger with time. The very next day, after the women sang their song, something dark happened in the palace. 1 Samuel 18:10 tells us, the next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre as he usually did. This was the same situation that had brought Saul relief many times before. David would play his harp and the evil spirit would leave. But this time was different. Saul was holding a spear, which verse 10 mentions. Saul had a spear in his hand. As David played, something snapped inside Saul. His jealousy combined with the evil spirit's influence and violence erupted. Verse 11 describes what happened, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul threw his spear at David with the full intention of killing him. He wanted to pin David to the wall like an animal to end this threat once and for all. But David saw it coming and moved out of the way. Then Saul did it again. He threw the spear a second time. And again, David escaped. The young man who had dodged lions and bears in the wilderness now had to dodge deadly weapons from the king he served. Why did David escape? Verse 12 gives us the answer. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. This was the heart of the problem. Saul could feel it. God's presence and blessing had left him and were now resting on David. Every victory David won, every success he achieved was a reminder to Saul of what he had lost through his disobedience. Saul decided he needed David out of his immediate presence. Verse 13 tells us, so he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in their campaigns. On the surface, this looked like a promotion. David was now a military commander leading troops into battle, but Saul's real motive was different. He hoped David would be killed in combat, solving his problem without Saul having to do it himself. But the plan backfired. Verse 14 says, in everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. David didn't die in battle. Instead, he won every campaign. He became an even better military leader than he had been a musician or a giant slayer. Every mission succeeded. Every battle was won. The more successful David became, the more afraid Saul grew. Verse 15 states, when Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. Success that should have made the king proud of his commander instead filled him with dread. But David's success had another effect on the nation. Verse 16 tells us, but all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. The people's affection for David grew stronger with every victory, which only deepened Saul's fear and jealousy. Saul had promised that whoever killed Goliath would marry his daughter, but he hadn't followed through on that promise immediately. Now he decided to use his daughters as bait in a trap to destroy David. 1 Samuel 18:17 records Saul's offer. Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter, Meb. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." Saul's plan was clever and cruel. He would offer his daughter to David, but the condition was that David had to keep fighting dangerous battles against the Philistines. Saul hoped that eventually David would be killed in combat and Saul's hands would be clean. He wouldn't have to murder David himself. The Philistines would do it for him. But David's response showed his humility. Verse 18 records his words, "Who am I? And what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the son-in-law of the king?" David didn't presume or demand what had been promised. He saw himself as unworthy of such an honor. When the time came for Meb to be given to David, Saul broke his promise. Verse 19 tells us, "So when the time came for Meb, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of me." Saul had another daughter named Michal, and she genuinely loved David. Verse 20 says, "Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased." Saul saw this as another opportunity. If Michal loved David, he could use her as bait for an even more dangerous trap. Saul sent servants to speak to David privately, encouraging him to become the king's son-in-law. But David gave the same humble response. Verse 23 records what he said, "Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known." David didn't have the wealth typically required for a bride price, especially for a princess. When the servants reported back to Saul, the king saw his chance. Verse 25 tells us, Saul replied, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. This was a brutal and dangerous task. Saul was asking David to kill 100 Philistine warriors and bring back proof. He was confident David would die attempting it. But David accepted the challenge. He was delighted at the prospect of becoming the king's son-in-law. Verse 26 says, "When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law." So before the allotted time elapsed, David took his men with him and went out and killed 200 Philistines and brought back their foreskins. David didn't just meet Saul's requirement. He doubled it. He killed 200 Philistines, not 100. He brought back proof and the numbers were verified. Now Saul had no choice. Verse 27 tells us they counted out the full number to the king so that David might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. The plan had completely backfired. Instead of David dying, he had won an even greater victory. Instead of being eliminated, he was now part of the royal family. Verse 28 describes Saul's realization. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. While Saul's hatred for David grew, something beautiful was happening between David and Saul's son, Jonathan. 1 Samuel 18:1 describes the beginning of their friendship. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. This wasn't a casual friendship. Their souls were knit together in a bond that went deeper than blood. Jonathan was the crown prince, next in line to be king. By all human logic, he should have seen David as a threat just like his father did. When people sang that David had killed tens of thousands, Jonathan should have worried about his own future. But instead of jealousy, Jonathan felt love. Instead of competition, he felt connection. Verse 3 tells us, "And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself." A covenant was the most serious form of commitment in that culture. It was a binding agreement, a promise that couldn't be broken. Jonathan was pledging his loyalty to David, committing himself to their friendship no matter what happened. The next verse shows just how deep Jonathan's commitment went. Verse 4 says, Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. These weren't just gifts, they were symbols. The robe and tunic represented Jonathan's royal status. The sword, bow, and belt represented his military authority. By giving these to David, Jonathan was symbolically saying that he recognized David's future kingship and was willing to support it even though it meant he himself would never be king. This friendship would be tested many times. Jonathan would be caught between his love for his father and his love for his friend. But through it all, his loyalty to David never wavered. Later in 1 Samuel 20:17, we see the depth of this covenant. And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan even made David promise something important. In 1 Samuel 20:14-15, Jonathan said, "But show me unfailing kindness like the Lord's kindness as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." Jonathan knew David would become king. He knew his father's line would end. But he asked David to show mercy to his family when that day came. Saul's hostility toward David reached a breaking point. 1 Samuel 19:1 tells us, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. This was no longer hidden jealousy or private plots. Saul openly commanded his own son and his servants to murder David. The situation had become deadly serious, but Jonathan warned David immediately. Verse 2 says, "But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, 'My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there.'" Jonathan was risking his own relationship with his father to protect his friend. He told David to hide while he talked to Saul. Jonathan spoke well of David to his father. Verses 4 and 5 record what he said. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?" Saul listened to Jonathan and took an oath. Verse 6 tells us, Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." Jonathan brought David back, and for a while things seemed normal again. David resumed his position in Saul's service just as before, but the peace didn't last. When war broke out again with the Philistines, David led the troops and struck them with such force that they fled. Verse 8 says, "Once more war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him." David's success triggered Saul's jealousy again. Verse 9 describes what happened next. "But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand." While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. This time, David didn't just dodge the spear, he ran. He knew he couldn't stay in the palace anymore. Saul had tried to kill him too many times. That same night, Saul sent men to watch David's house. Verse 11 tells us, Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But David's wife, Michal, loved him and knew her father's intentions. She warned David in verse 11, but Michal, David's wife, warned him, "If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed." She helped him escape through a window, and David fled into the night. Verse 12 says, "So Michal let David down through a window and he fled and escaped." Michal then created a diversion to buy David time. Verse 13 tells us, "Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul's men came in the morning to seize David, she told them he was sick in bed." Verse 14 says, "When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, 'He is ill.' Saul sent the men back with orders to bring David in his bed if necessary. But when they entered, they discovered the deception." Verse 16 tells us, "But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. David was long gone. The shepherd who had once lived in the palace was now a fugitive running for his life. David ran to the prophet Samuel in Ramah, the only person he felt he could fully trust. 1 Samuel 19:18 tells us, when David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. David needed counsel, protection, and probably just someone who would understand what he was going through. But Saul found out where David was. Verse 19 says, "Word to Saul, David is in Naioth at Ramah." Saul sent men to capture him. But something supernatural happened when they arrived and saw Samuel leading a group of prophets who were prophesying. The Spirit of God came on Saul's men and they also began prophesying. Saul sent more men and the same thing happened. He sent a third group and they prophesied too. Finally, Saul went himself. Verse 23 tells us, "But the Spirit of God came even on him and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth." God himself was protecting David, making it impossible for Saul to capture him even when he tried personally. David couldn't stay in one place. He had to keep moving. He went to Nob where the priest Amalek served. 1 Samuel 21:1 says, David went to Nob to Amalek the priest. Ahimch trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David was supposed to be a commander with troops, yet here he was alone and looking desperate. David lied to the priest telling him he was on a secret mission for the king. He asked for bread and Ahimch gave him the consecrated bread, the holy bread from the tabernacle. Then David asked for a weapon. Verse 8 records his request. David asked Ahimch, "Don't you have a spear or a sword here?" "I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's mission was urgent." Ahimch had something remarkable. Verse 9 tells us, the priest replied, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine whom you killed in the valley of Ah is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one." David said, "There is none like it. Give it to me." David took the very sword he had used to cut off Goliath's head. It was fitting that the weapon of his greatest public victory would now accompany him in his darkest hour. David even fled to Gath, Goliath's hometown, seeking refuge among the Philistines. But the servants of Achish, king of Gath, recognized him. Verse 11 records their words, "Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." David realized he was in serious danger. To escape, he pretended to be insane. Verse 13 says, "So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard." The act worked. Achish wanted nothing to do with a madman. David escaped to the cave of Adullam. 1 Samuel 22:1 tells us, David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. His family joined him, concerned for his safety, but David wasn't alone for long. Verse 2 says, "All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. People who were struggling, who had been rejected by society, who had nowhere else to turn. They came to David. The rejected shepherd became the leader of rejected men. And together, they formed a loyal band that would stand with him through the darkest years ahead. Saul's paranoia reached a terrible climax. He gathered his officials and accused them of conspiracy. 1 Samuel 22:8 records his words, "Is that why you have all conspired against me? No one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie and wait for me as he does today." One man spoke up. Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief shepherd. Verse 9 tells us, "But Doeg the Edomite, who was standing with Saul's officials, said, I saw the son of Jesse come to Amalek, son of Ahab, at Nob." Doeg had been there when David visited the priest. He told Saul everything, how Ahimch had inquired of the Lord for David, given him provisions, and provided him with Goliath's sword. Saul immediately sent for Ahimch and all the priests. When they arrived, Saul accused them of conspiracy. Verse 13 records his charges. Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me? you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and lies in wait for me as he does today." Ahimelech defended himself. Verses 14 and 15 record his response. Ahimelech answered the king, "Who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair." But Saul wouldn't listen. Verse 16 tells us, "But the king said, 'You will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your whole family.'" Then Saul gave a horrifying command to his guards. Verse 17 records it. Then the king ordered the guards at his side, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me." But the king's officials were not willing to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Saul's own guards refused. They wouldn't kill God's priests. So Saul turned to Doeg. Verse 18 says, "The king then ordered Doeg, 'You turn and strike down the priests.' So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. Doeg murdered 85 priests of God in cold blood. But the massacre didn't stop there. Verse 19 tells us he also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children and infants, and its oxen, donkeys, and sheep. Doeg went to Nob and killed everyone, men, women, children, bobbies, even the animals. It was complete genocide of the priestly city, all because they had unknowingly helped David. One priest escaped. Verse 20 says, "But one son of Ahimelech, son of Ahub, named Abner, escaped and fled to join David." When Abner told David what had happened, David felt the weight of responsibility. Verse 22 records his response. "Then David said to Abner, 'That day when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul, I am responsible for the death of your whole family.'" David's life became a constant cycle of running and hiding. 1 Samuel 23:14 tells us, "David stayed in the wilderness strongholds and in the hills of the desert of Ziph. Day after day, Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. Every single day, Saul hunted for David, but God protected him, keeping him one step ahead of the king's pursuit. At one point, the Ziphites betrayed David's location to Saul. Verse 19 records their message. The Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horsh on the hill of Hachilah, south of Jessamine?" They were giving Saul detailed information about where to find David. Saul was grateful and told them to get more precise information, but before he could capture David, urgent news arrived. Verse 27 tells us, "A messenger came to Saul, saying, 'Come quickly. The Philistines are raiding the land.'" Saul had to break off his pursuit to deal with the Philistine threat. Verse 28 says, "Then Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. That is why they call this place Silla-Hamelech, which means the rock of escape." Later, David would describe his situation to Saul in powerful words. 1 Samuel 26:20 records what he said, "Now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea as one hunts a partridge in the mountains." David compared himself to a small, insignificant bird being hunted through the mountains by a powerful king. It was an image of desperation and disproportion, a king with his entire army chasing one man through the wilderness. During his years as a fugitive, David had two remarkable opportunities to kill Saul and end his persecution. The first happened at Endad. 1 Samuel. Chapter 24:1 tells us, "After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told David is in the desert of Engedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. Saul needed to relieve himself and entered a cave alone. What he didn't know was that David and his men were hiding deep in that same cave. Verse 3 says, "He came to the sheep pens along the way." A cave was there and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. David's men immediately saw this as divine intervention. Verse 4 records their whispered encouragement. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." They believed God had delivered Saul into David's hands. This was the perfect chance. Saul was alone, vulnerable, and completely unaware of their presence. But David didn't kill Saul. Instead, he crept forward quietly and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Even this small act bothered David. Verse 5 tells us, "Afterward David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He felt guilty just for damaging the king's clothing." When Saul left the cave, David followed him outside. Verses 8 and 9 record what happened. "Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, 'My lord the king.' When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, 'Why do you listen when men say, David is bent on harming you?'" David showed the piece of robe as proof that he could have killed Saul, but chose not to. David explained his reasoning in verse 10. "This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed." Nor David's respect for God's anointing was greater than his desire for revenge or self-preservation. The second opportunity came later. 1 Samuel 26:7 tells us, "So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him." David and his nephew Abishai had walked right into Saul's camp while everyone slept. Abishai saw the opportunity and begged David. Verse 8 records his words, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice." Abishai was ready to kill Saul immediately, but David refused. Verse 9 captures his response. "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" Even though Saul had tried to kill David repeatedly, David would not kill God's anointed king. Instead, David took Saul's spear and water jug. Verse 12 tells us, "So David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head, and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep." David eventually grew weary of constantly running from Saul. 1 Samuel 27:1 tells us, "But David thought to himself, 'One of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand.'" So David made a bold decision. He took his 600 men and crossed over to Achish, king of Gath. This time Achish welcomed him. Verse 5 records David's request. "Then David said to Achish, 'If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you?' Achish gave him the town of Ziklag, and David lived there for 16 months. Later, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel, and Achish expected David to join them. But the Philistine commanders didn't trust David. 1 Samuel 29:4 tells us, "But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, 'Send the man back that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting.' David and his men headed back to Ziklag, but what they found there devastated them completely. 1 Samuel 30:1 describes the scene. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them but carried them off as they went on their way. Everything was gone. Verse 3 says, "When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive." David's 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, were among the captives. The entire town had been burned to the ground and everyone they loved had been kidnapped. The grief was overwhelming. Verse 4 tells us, "So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. But then the situation got even worse for David." Verse 6 says, "David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters." This was David's lowest moment. His family was captured, his city burned, and his own men wanted to kill him. But the verse continues with something crucial. But David found strength in the Lord his God. When everything collapsed, David turned to God. David inquired of the Lord and received permission to pursue the raiders. Verses 8 and N record, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" "Pursue them," he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." David and the 600 men with him came to the Besser Valley. Verse 17 tells us, David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away, except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. Verse 18 records the result. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. It was total recovery. While David was recovering from the Amalekite raid, a massive battle was taking place between Israel and the Philistines. 1 Samuel 31:1 tells us, "Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa." The battle went badly for Israel from the start. The Philistines focused their attack on Saul and his sons. Verse 2 says, "The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malishua." David's closest friend, Jonathan, died in battle alongside his brothers. The royal line was being destroyed on the battlefield. Then the Philistines concentrated on Saul himself. Verse 3 tells us, "The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically." Though Saul was severely injured by Philistine arrows, unable to continue fighting, knowing he was about to be captured, Saul made a desperate decision. Verse 4 records his final moments. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. The armor-bearer saw what Saul had done and followed his example. In one day, Israel lost its king, the crown prince, 2 other royal sons, and countless soldiers. The news took time to reach David. 2 Samuel 1:2 tells us, "On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. The messenger came with the posture of grief and respect. David asked him where he came from. The man replied in verse 3, 'I have escaped from the Israelite camp.' David immediately wanted to know what happened. Verse 4 records the answer. What happened? David asked, 'Tell me.' The men fled from the battle, he said. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. David's response was immediate and deep. Verse 11 tells us, "Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword." David didn't celebrate Saul's death. Instead, he mourned deeply. He composed a lament for Saul and Jonathan. Verse 26 captures David's heart for Jonathan. "I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women." David had lost his closest friend and his greatest enemy on the same day. After mourning for Saul and Jonathan, David sought God's direction for his next step. 2 Samuel 2:1 tells us, "In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?' he asked. The Lord said, 'Go up.' David asked, 'Where shall I go to Hebron?' The Lord answered. David obeyed. Verse 2 says, "So David went up there with his 2 wives, Anom of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns." Then something significant happened. Verse 4 tells us, "Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah." This was David's second anointing. He had been anointed privately by Samuel as a boy, and now he was anointed publicly as king over his own tribe. He was 30 years old when this happened, but the rest of Israel didn't immediately accept David. Verse 8 introduces the complication. Meanwhile, Abner, son of En, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Asher, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Civil war broke out between those loyal to Saul's house and those who followed David. Verse 11 says, "The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months." But 2 Samuel 3:1 summarizes the trend. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Eventually, both Abner and Ishbosheth were killed, not by David's hand, but by others seeking their own gain. When Ishbosheth died, all the tribes recognized it was time to unite under David. 2 Samuel 5:1 records what happened. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" The elders came to make a covenant with David. Verse 3 tells us, "When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel." This was David's third anointing. Verses 4 and 5 give us the complete picture. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. The shepherd boy anointed in secret had finally become the king of all Israel. David was now king of a united Israel, but he needed a capital city that would belong to all 12 tribes. Jerusalem was perfect. It sat between the northern and southern tribes and was still controlled by the Jebusites. 2 Samuel 5:6 tells us, "The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, 'You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off.' They thought, 'David cannot get in here,' the Jebusites. They were so confident in their city's defenses that they mocked David. But verse 7 says, "Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. The city became David's headquarters." Verse 9 tells us, "David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward. David's power and influence grew." Verse 10 explains why, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. International recognition came quickly. Verse 11 tells us, "Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David." David understood what was happening. Verse 12 records his realization. "Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel." David recognized that his kingship wasn't about personal glory. God had made him king for the benefit of God's people. With his kingdom secure, David turned his attention to bringing the Ark of God to Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 6:1 tells us, "David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. This was a massive gathering showing how important this moment was. Verse 2 describes the mission. "He and all his men went to Bala in Judah to bring up from there the Ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark." The ark represented God's presence, and David wanted it at the center of Israel's national life. They placed the ark on a new cart and began the journey. Verse 5 says, "David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, serums, and cymbals." This was pure joy, uninhibited worship. But something went wrong. Verse 6 tells us, "When they came to the thrashing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. David was angry and afraid. He stopped the procession and left the ark at the house of Obed for 3 months. Verse 11 says, "The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household." When David heard how God blessed Obed-Edom's house, he decided to try again. This time he did it properly. Verse 13 says, "When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. They moved slowly, offering sacrifices showing proper reverence. David's joy was complete and unrestrained." Verse 14 tells us, "Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets." David didn't act like a dignified king. He danced with abandon. But his wife Michal despised his enthusiasm. Verse 16 says, "As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart." When David came home, Michal confronted him with sarcasm. Verse 20 records her words, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half-naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David's response showed where his priorities lay. Verse 21 says, "David said to Michal, 'It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes.'" David refused to be ashamed of his worship. After David settled into his palace, he noticed something that bothered him. 2 Samuel 7:2 records what he told Nathan the prophet, "Here I am living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." David felt guilty that he had a beautiful palace while God's ark stayed in a temporary structure. Nathan's initial response seemed encouraging. Verse 3 says, "Nathan replied to the king, 'Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you.'" But that night, God spoke to Nathan with a different message. Verses 4-7 record God's response. "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, 'Why have you not built me a house of cedar?'" God wasn't asking for a temple. Then God turned the tables. Instead of David building a house for God, God would build a house for David. Not a physical building, but a dynasty. Verses 11 and 12 contain God's promise. "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom." The promise continued in verse 13. "He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." Verse 16 seals this eternal covenant. "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." This wasn't just about Solomon. This was a promise that reached into eternity, ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ, the Son of David who would reign forever. David's response was pure humility and worship. Verse 18 tells us, "Then King David went in and sat before the Lord." Verses 18 and 19 record his prayer. "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. And this decree, sovereign Lord, is for a mere human." David was speechless before God's grace. A shepherd boy who had spent years running for his life was now being promised an eternal dynasty. What made David a man after God's own heart, as 1 Samuel 13:14 described him? It wasn't that David was perfect. He would later commit serious sins. It wasn't that he never made mistakes. His life was full of them. What set David apart was the consistent orientation of his heart toward God in every circumstance. In the fields as a shepherd, David worshipped. The Psalms reveal a man who saw God in creation, who talked to God in solitude, who composed songs of praise when no one was listening. Psalm 23 captures this. "The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul." When facing Goliath, David's confidence wasn't in his own ability but in God's power. He told the giant, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against me in the name of the Lord Almighty." His trust was complete and public. During his fugitive years, when everything fell apart at Ziklag, David found strength in the Lord his God. He didn't turn bitter or blame God for his suffering. He turned to God for help, and God answered. When given two opportunities to kill Saul, David refused because he is the Lord's anointed. David's respect for God's authority was greater than his desire for revenge. When bringing the ark to Jerusalem, David danced before the Lord with all his might, not caring what anyone thought. His worship was uninhibited and passionate, focused entirely on honoring God. When God promised him an eternal dynasty, David's response was humble amazement. "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far?" He never took God's blessings for granted. Throughout his life, David wrote psalms that exposed his heart completely before God. He wrote songs of praise. "I will exalt you, my God, the King. I will praise your name forever and ever." From Psalm 145. He wrote songs of confession. "Have mercy on me, O God. According to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions." From Psalm 51. He wrote songs of trust. "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." From Psalm 23. David's heart beat in rhythm with God's heart. He loved what God loved. He hated what God hated. He trusted God in impossible situations. He worshiped God in good times and bad. He repented quickly when he sinned. He never stopped returning to God, never stopped seeking God's face, never stopped pouring out his heart in honest communication with his Creator. That was the heart of a man after God's own heart. A heart that, despite all its flaws and failures, consistently turned toward God in worship, trust, and passionate devotion.